Okay, and we are recording, so take it away, Dr. Holthouse. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Hopefully you can see my PowerPoint at this point. Let me know if you can't and I can work on it.
Yes, nope, it's perfect.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me and good morning to everybody here. It's good to be here. I apologize in advance if I cough or anything. I've come down with some kind of cold or something in the last 2 days, so I'm fighting through that, but excited to be here and talk about EAB. Emerald ash borer has been a large part of what I've done over the last 12 months, really in earnest. A lot of work. I just started my management role here at the IPPM program, or Insect Pest Prevention and Management Program, and back in August. And so I really jumped on board right about when all of this was going crazy. So yeah, I've spent a lot of time on emerald ash borer and excited to share what's gone right and what hasn't, and hopefully it's helpful to the group today. So, and let me know, Laurel, if anybody has any questions or anything like that. Sometimes I get distracted. I don't notice if there are questions or things like that. I'm totally fine with people interrupting me wherever they feel like. And yeah, I think feedback and a discussion today would be welcomed. So
Okay, great. Yeah, on that note, the chat I don't think works for this format. So if anybody has questions, please use the question and answer feature, and my supervisor, Lee Greenwood, will be monitoring that. And then also, I think you can use the raise hand icon and we'll be able to take you off mute if you'd rather state your question. So thank you for reminding me to say that. On all good.
Awesome. Well, I have a few things that to get started here in the beginning that are really more basic and, more review. I'll go quickly there. If you want me to slow down and someone's not, privy to emerald ash borer, I can definitely go over it in more detail. But I think a lot of us here at this point are probably pretty well versed in the way of emerald ash borer. But it's always important to go over the basics in case anybody doesn't know. So emerald ash borer, again, Agrilus planipennis, is an invasive buprestid from Asia, and has real propensity to take out our North American ash that have very little resistance compared to those found in Asia. And pretty massive estimates here and wide range of resources that you could probably get this information from, but from some of this literature that I've reviewed and looked at, and many other people that have come before me and talked about, we're looking at, somewhere between 20 and $50 billion spent on this pest in the US as of late. And so, obviously, even if you don't care about this insect, your pocketbook does at some point. So it's a major issue for many of us in the US and now for Oregon. And obviously that equates to major ecological damage created by loss of canopy cover and our native tree species in some of these forests across the US. Also important to have some idea of the life cycle of emerald ash borer. As I'm speaking today, I'll talk about its host plants as well as its biological control mechanisms and agents. And so it's good for us to understand that this can be a univoltine or semi-voltine insect. And so that means it could be that you have one egg to adult generation per year, or that egg to adult progression could take up to 2 years, depending on things like temperature, condition of the host plant, things like that. Also, important to know that emergence of this pest, usually where we have adult flight period, is somewhere between May and October, depending on where you are in North America or its native range. There's 4 larval instars that feed primarily from June through November, and the phloem of ash trees and other hosts. And the larvae and pupae overwinter from October to May. So they're just hanging out in the bark, underneath the bark, I should say, waiting for next year's emergence. And we can take a brief look too at the kind of invasion story here, where we discovered it moving from its native range in Asia there to Michigan in 2002. We have learned from other scientists that there's potentially a little bit earlier invasion, where we think it's in the late 90s that it actually showed up. That was done through some dendrological research, and we find that some of the galleries and the trees that were initially infested were probably infested before 2002, and now detected in 36 states in the United States. A quick look at, again, the potential damage, right? Emerald ash borer, I think a lot of times we wave our hands around a lot as pest managers, and people start to kind of turn a blind eye to some of these things that we present. But I think this is truly a devastating insect in many ways, but it's very impactful when it does show up to your area. And this, on the left, you can see the street depicted on the right, mirrored image, but it's the same street and they're 3 years apart. So on the left, you can see where, before emerald ash borer has been a real problem. And then 3 years later, after emerald ash borer has infested and had its way with these trees, major impact there, obviously, to the canopy in that neighborhood. Again, just a review on damage. You're having phloem feeding going on by these larval instars that we talked about. Usually an S-shaped gallery in the phloem, these kind of serpentine back and forth patterns. And eventually, if you get a large enough infestation up in the canopy on the branches and then down into the bole of the tree, you get girdling that goes on, and that cuts off nutrient flow to the upper part of the tree, and you get die off. And for the most part, we're dealing with the genus Fraxinus, and so all those ash species that fall in that genus, as well as white fringe tree and cultivated olive. Right now, the ODA is working with some of the grad students on the East Coast to actually go after this idea of cultivated olive in a little more earnest. We want to understand specifically what the risk is to olive here in Oregon, because we do have a little budding Oregon olive industry. And so we're taking a closer look at that. But these are known hosts. Also important to understand the potential spread, especially as we're talking about Oregon and trying to understand how fast it's going to move across this new range that it's in here in Oregon. We know it's here, and we're not going to get rid of it necessarily. And so understanding our risk of spread is really important first step. And so we know from flight mill studies that it can go, roughly 5 kilometers per year if it's pushed to do so in kind of an artificial fashion. And you can see here on the right, I've thrown a map together really quickly. In the very center of this circle, we've got a few red dots, and that's the initial detections there in Forest Grove, Washington County of Oregon. And these squares here are essentially, you can think of them as 1 mile plots here. And so, we're moving at 5 kilometers a year, or 3 miles or whatever. We're looking at 1, 2, 3, just outside of Cornelius is a little neighboring town that we could potentially have movement to. But in reality, we look at the research and we know that most of these females that are flying from their emergence tree aren't moving very far. And so we assume that biologically relevant information is where we've got movement within Forest Grove primarily. And again, there's other research from dendrochronology that suggests that new infestation spreads at 3.8 kilometers per year. So not too much different from flight mills, a little less. And when we talk about the possibility of jumps or satellite kind of spot fire populations, the number gets a lot larger. And that's Nate Siegert, who's been working on EAB for many years now, has found that as you get an established population, you will inevitably have these satellite populations that show up peripheral to the ground zero area. And so that can be a much farther spread. And so 13 kilometers, that's what we're pushing, 8 or 9 miles there. And so this buffer here is a 6 mile buffer. And so all of a sudden satellite populations might be showing up out here towards Hillsborough, which is on the edge of the major, Portland metro area. And so, yeah, again, spread is inevitable, and understanding that spread is really important. This gives you a rough idea of the spread in the United States when it was first found in 2002, and as it radiated out year by year from Michigan. Gives us a good idea, kind of, again, at a temporal scale. I thought this was a cool map, a lot of fun. This is USDA APHIS put this together. You can see Colorado is that first real big jump. You got another one in Texas. And then all of a sudden, here we are in Oregon, which is really unfortunate to see that massive of a jump. And just to give some perspective there, if we look at that Detroit to Denver jump, which is, most likely, well, pretty much certainly human mediated, That's, roughly 182 kilometers per year within that time period. If we look at the idea of human mediated transfer between ground zero and where we are here in Oregon now, that's roughly 160 kilometers per year. If it made its way through Colorado to us, that's roughly 178 kilometers per year. And so, at that point, pretty much anybody's vulnerable. And so we just happen to get a bad dose of firewood or whatever else was the vector of this initial population. But real bummer for sure. And now that we have it here in Oregon, obviously the major implication is Oregon and its ash. And conveniently, our native species is called Oregon ash. And we have that all over the state, as well as goes into California, Washington, and British Columbia, Canada. Unique factors here would be, it's got this kind of, for lack of a better term right now, like a hairy kind of texture on the underside of the leaves. And you can also see that the petiole is very short, connected there to the stalk. There's a quick image of its seeds as well. And so a little bit different from some of the other green ash, white ash that you might be more familiar with in other parts of the nation. And so we're, obviously very concerned about the species, as it is, we now know fully susceptible to emerald ash borer infestation and a competent host, and, well established in this area that emerald ash borer is. And we're seeing, many infested Oregon ash. And this tree provides a really important ecosystem services here in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest at large, and as well as cultural value to our native tribes. And most of these are occurring below the Cascades, west of the Cascades, in the Willamette Valley, and act as important part of our riparian ecosystems. And this is a slide I stole from Wyatt Williams at ODF, Oregon Department of Forestry. But I think it highlights really well that we have really high density of ash along our riparian corridors. I've been talking to some of our local cooperators who do a lot of land conservation, and some of these areas are, upwards of 60 to 80% ash. And so if you do, have this progression that we've seen in the East Coast, where you lose this canopy in, potentially 3 to 4 years, you have a major change in temperature along these waterways. And here in Oregon, we are a state of rivers, and large tributaries, and obviously huge salmon networks. And so we have this mass die-off of Oregon ash. We have a real problem on our hands, where we're going to have, change in water temperature, which affects amphibians, our fish. And so we have a big job to do to understand how to cope with this invasion. This gives you another idea of some of the established range here of ash density in the state of Oregon as well. And on the right, you can see, the West Coast in general, where this species occurs. And there's our little tiny olive industry that's getting its start as well. And so, I think a big part of the story is understanding what Oregon has done to kind of respond. And I'll go through briefly here just the timeline of what happened. And, I think this might be important if you find yourself in this situation as another neighboring state. You can see how long it took us to respond and hopefully learn from what we've done. But June 30th, we have this Oregon dad who we now know as Dominic Mays. He was a first detector. He had taken first detector training through the OSU extension, and he was dropping his children off at school, I think for like a summer camp situation. And he was sitting there in the parking lot and noticed that some of these young ornamental ash trees looked pretty bad. And on closer inspection, actually observed flying adults. And on the right there, you can see some pictures that were taken of some of the adults that were actually so dense in number that he was able to see them flying around, feeding on leaves. And for those of you that understand emerald ash borer infestation levels, that's pretty far gone. If you're seeing adults flying around, feeding on leaves, that's a pretty bad situation. And so Oregon Department of Forestry and their entomologists responded that same day and found 16 infested trees. Christine Buell, one of those entomologists, confirmed that it was emerald ash borer, found galleries under the bark, as you can see there on the right. And those are extremely dense galleries. I mean, those larvae were running into each other, and they're all the way down to the base, the soil level. So just pretty extensive infestation. You can see the D-shaped exit holes here in the bark, adults present. And this was, again, was at Forest Grove Elementary School. And so the standing ash were cut down and chipped 1 inch by 1 inch. And our taxonomist again confirmed that ID. So that's 2 people looking at confirmation, samples sent to USDA for their confirmation. And then we started to scout the surrounding area as well. And we found that there were additional infestations. You can see where we kind of circled in red those trees that we felled, that were the initial infested ornamentals. And then we kind of on the right, you can see a kind of a street map view of where we started finding some of these other ash, but I think mostly green ash and Oregon ash in the surrounding area, mostly planted in people's, rows along the city streets. And an apartment complex just to the north had quite a few. There's a Safeway north of that had a number that had clear signs of infestation, as well as the park that was adjacent property. And so we immediately started, we got the confirmation back from the USDA and started working on letting people know. And so we had a press release July 11th where we released, what information we knew. And we quickly set up the Oregon Invasive Species Council hotline to be ready for people to report sightings of this insect as well. And that's been a really helpful component where it's kind of a larger repository of photos that people can report, not on just emerald ash borer, but on other invasives as well. And this is a hotline that ODF, ODA, and several other cooperators visit and frequent to make sure we're keeping track of what the public is seeing. And it worked pretty well. Obviously a huge job to keep up with, but it did help us orient ourselves there in the beginning around areas that might be concerned. And then we also immediately, we relied on our response plan that was written up 2 years earlier, which was great. Wyatt Williams at ODF and a few of my predecessors here at ODA had written up a document to kind of basically step us through first steps if this were to happen. And so I highly recommend, if you haven't done that as a state yet, work on that, get organized. But the task force was a huge part of that anticipated response. And so we immediately formed a task force, which would meet monthly. And we'd have, hopefully everyone getting organized around surveys, trapping, and whatever else we wanted to be working on. We quickly found out that it's a lot of work to get multiple agencies to join one platform, and teams had lots of glitches in the beginning, and we kind of got a chuckle after that, trying to figure that out, but eventually got everyone on the same page. 40 plus agencies and counting. We're continuing to add people to this task force, and this meets again monthly, and we have 7 subcommittees that go after survey and monitoring. That's my group. Wyatt at Oregon Department of Forestry does wood waste. We have a whole training subcommittee that works on, how we can get more people trained in first detector and whatever else. We have an IPM group that works very closely with our comms group. They're kind of one and the same. We have a research group that meets and tries to take what's happening in the field and, go at the larger, big idea questions there. And obviously communication to share everything that we're doing, and funding and steering committees as well. And I will say too, I think a lot of times we hear the word task force or committees, and it sounds like a lot of slowdown in some people's minds, but I will say it's worked really well for us, and we've had a lot of engagement. And I don't know if that's just Oregon, but I've been pleasantly surprised at the effectiveness of these meetings. And so, let's look further at our response here. Survey is a big component of the task force and what's gone on here at the Oregon Department of Agriculture. But again, it couldn't go on without our local cooperators. And we've had wonderful local cooperators. And just like preparing with a response plan, I would also push everyone here to think about who is on the ground in your state. If you're in an uninfested state right now and you don't have emerald ash borer, I would think about, if you did have it show up, who are your team players? Who's going to be on the ground that knows your river corridors, your riparian corridors really well? How do you get connected with them now so that you're on the same page? Clean Water Services, Oregon Metro, and our soil and water conservation districts, specifically to the Tualatin one, have been exceptional. They have massive amounts of data over the last 20 years on most of these areas around Forest Grove. I mean, we have very, very excellent data. So we're able to come into the situation and say, here's where our known infested trees are. And Clean Water Services, Metro, and the Soil and Water Conservation Districts basically said, we've been on, you know, X amount of acres around Forest Grove for this many years. And here's all the, you know, Oregon ash that is potentially, you know, on the chopping block here for being at major risk, and have been able to get us on the ground to do efforts that I'll talk about in a moment really quickly. And so can't emphasize local cooperators enough. You got to reach out and have those connections. And so the ODA pushed for survey and monitoring. Back in November, we got emergency funding from the state, and then built up a seasonal team of 4 people, as well as a coordinator and comms group, and started doing visual survey with Survey 123 app through ArcGIS, and used this app to start creating a database of all those ash trees that we are seeing, whether they're infested or not, were they suspect, galleries present, and a whole list of questionnaires that were affiliated with that app and its survey. We also did some trapping, and we've now passed that off to USDA APHIS, helping Oregon Department of Forestry kind of do that with the local soil and water conservation districts. So again, local cooperators helping push forward detection and surveying. And we held some trainings with USDA APHIS to also get this off the ground, and worked on our own treatment and response plan, and that would use this survey and monitoring data. And then we created a dashboard with all of that survey data coming in, so that people, all of our local cooperators, as well as the public, this is publicly available, could see live data of where we actually had infested trees, suspect trees, and those trees that are not currently affected, which is the gray dots there. And this is something that you can go access if you want to take a closer look. And we found that, you know, the current extent, it's for the most part within the Forest Grove area. There are a few southerly detections just outside of city limits in some riparian areas, which is unfortunate, because obviously that means that we're potentially dealing with a larger issue than we know. And so that's why survey is where we started, to get a grasp of what that extent is. But right now we've surveyed visually over 9,000 trees. We've gotten 42 positives, 314 suspect, which we'll be going back this summer to look at again to get a better idea of what's going on. And again, these are being made by those that have been trained by our entomologists. And we have a large team now built up, not just our team, but other state agencies and local cooperators are part of that as well. And this gives you a perspective of, you know, if you can see Portland there on the right, where we've been doing most of our efforts is primarily within a 6-mile buffer around Forest Grove. And you can see those are our 9,000 data points of where we've inspected ash. And I think this has really been helpful, as you can see that we've got this initial detection there in the center of that red box, and a few peripheral red detection sites just outside of the city. But again, our negative data is giving us a touch more confidence that right now it's holding the Forest Grove area. Just for some perspective here too, where we're really putting the fight here is trying to understand our river corridors, because we know that's where the Oregon ash is. And so we want to slow it down as much as possible from moving into these Tualatin River watershed, which is here along this, you can see the Tualatin River Wildlife Refuge. That's eventually where we really want to slow it from ending up, because if it gets this far down the Tualatin, it'll eventually make its way to the Willamette River through Portland and out to the Columbia. And those are major, refuges for a lot of our Oregon ash, and again, important river systems for our state. This just gives another zoomed in view of where our positive detections are within Forest Grove. Again, our main initial detections are here around the school, some of the local parks nearby. This is a university. All these trees right now we're working on taking down. They're heavily infested, and so we're working with the city of Forest Grove with our emergency state funding to fell those and to chip them, so that we're kind of hopefully putting a halt on the sink population that will be acting as the propagular pressure. If we can cut these trees down and chip them, we're hoping we can take a large chunk of the population down. Again, this is not an eradication effort. It's merely to slow it down. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. This is some more data that we're bringing in the area. Our visual surveys also assess, land cover. And so we're trying to get an idea of, is this an area, if we're looking at a 1/4 by 1/4 mile grid system, where is the ash dominant? Where is it not? Where do we have farming that's not going to be of real risk? And that helps inform our efforts as well. And so again, where does all this data go? You've got to do something with it. And right now we've chosen to lean on the wisdom of Nate Siegert, Deb McCullough, others in the East that have been working on this for the last 2 decades. And SLAM, or slow ash mortality, is where we've really turned our gaze in a big way. And again, this is not an eradication effort here in Oregon. It is a slow ash mortality effort, really. We want to slow this thing down as much as possible, so that we can give our cooperators who are, keeping this land productive and effective as much time to, gather analog replacement species. I'll talk in a minute about biological control and giving that time to get initiated. So there are a multitude of reasons to slow this pest down, but that's where we're going first. And a good place to start as well is quarantine work. And so, back in November, we put in a temporary quarantine that would effectively stop all movement of ash, olive and white fringe tree from Washington County. And we're now working on creating a permanent rule that will be hopefully effective by this fall. I think we're desperately trying to gather more information on olive and potentially take that out of the equation. Our olive growers are working with us right now on setting up some different experiments in the area, like I mentioned earlier, and we want to understand EAB phenology and development in olive trees here in Oregon better. And so we're partnering to do research on that. But a quarantine has been really helpful. We have a large amount of nurseries and others that move ash in the state, arborists, a lot of trees in Oregon. So there's many ways that this thing can move. And so we're really trying to stop that movement as much as possible, which I think is the theme of this group. And I'm excited to be a part of that idea. And then the other part of this is, we're going to slow it down. How do we attract it to certain areas to, keep the smaller population from spreading? Girdled trap trees is a huge component of this SLAM strategy. So essentially, you come along and you girdle a tree so that you stop the transport of phloem up that tree, so that you're really only got a little bit of trickle water that is making it up to the canopy. And so it creates this stressed, delayed death of a tree. And this stressed trap tree, or this girdled tree, will emit volatiles into the air that is very attractive to emerald ash borer. And if you have a small population in the area, that small population will congregate on that stressed tree and go after it, knowing that its larvae will do well as that tree is more immunocompromised. And so that will allow us to, again, kind of use this as a sentinel tree to understand where our populations are moving. As we go back later this year and inspect some of these girdled trees, which we just finished girdling, we'll be able to debark and assess, do we have an infestation going on? Are there larval galleries there? And help us understand the movement and the dynamic of that population in the area. And near these girdled trees, we'll have treatment trees. 2 to 3 treatment trees will be put in close proximity to these trap trees, so that as you get these emerald ash borer moving into these trap trees, they are going to run into treatment trees as well. And so systemic injections of imamectin benzoate will go on in 2 to 3 trees per trap tree, so that, again, you're not only understanding where EAB is, but you're also nuking that population in the area as they move into that tree. And we hope that also protects a few of our, more established mature trees around these girdled trees as well, which will also protect the seed bank for however long the land manager decides to continue treatment. Again, we're sponsoring the initial treatment, and others will carry the torch after that. It's merely a Band-Aid. But we are calling this effort the Ring of Fire, and essentially we are trying to create a ring around Forest Grove. And I know this is a kind of a terrible map because there's no labels, and I apologize for that. But essentially, this left mass of residential area is Forest Grove. The right mass is Cornelius there. And so we have selected around Gales Creek, which is to the west side of this image. We have Council Creek to the north with some of those red dots along it. Dairy Creek to the northeast there, as well as the Tualatin River there to the south. And we tried to create kind of a uniform selection of trap trees, which are going to be girdled. We've picked 100 of those. And again, those are attracting any EAB in the area to themselves. And then 172 treatment trees will be in real close proximity around those trap trees. And so hopefully, again, what will happen here is that we'll start to get detections in parts of this ring, and that will tell us, where we have EAB movement, and it will help land managers in the area assess their problem, and also give us an idea of what river systems are being infiltrated as well. It's a monumental effort, and I'm really proud of my team for, getting all this work done in 6 months. We're working on the treatment right now, but the girdled trees have already been completed as of this week, and we're working on treatments here in May and June. So yeah, pretty massive effort, and I hope it's fruitful for what we find here in the years to come. Here's another view of it here. I should have shown this earlier. This kind of gives you a better perspective of some of the spatial dynamics here around Forest Grove. And you can see, again, we have a lot of wetlands that are full of Oregon ash around the south portion there, and that's where Clean Water Services and some of our other cooperators are working in earnest as well. Here's us selecting a tree to be girdled. We go ahead and mark the tree, red for girdle, blue for treatment, and then you work on girdling that tree. And you can see Emily here has found a gallery in one of these girdled trap trees. I think this is within the inner part of the ring, and so we were pretty sure that we would find this. But again, if you're finding this kind of gallery this far down in the tree, you've got, probably at least a few years into your infestation in that area. And you can see on the left is our girdled trap tree, drawing those EAB in, and on the right is that tree to be treated with systemics. You can kind of see as the EAB were to make its way to that trap tree, it might also encounter that treatment tree as well. And here's the gallery, another gallery that was found there. Again, you can see early on in the infestation when there's not as much crowding and density, they'll have a little more elongated gallery in the way of their S-shaped gallery there. And a big deal here in Oregon is Himalayan blackberry. It's a real pain in the neck. And we have a whole group of people dedicated to clearing some of the areas around these Oregon ash as they're out here in wild stands. It can be difficult to get access. That's been a huge hurdle as well. But again, this slow ash mortality effort really has multitude of benefits, but a large part of it that we're a part of is the biological control aspect. We're working with USDA APHIS on releasing parasitoid wasps. We have 2 sites selected I'll talk about in a moment. And we know from previous research that's been done by others that we've got a variety of wasps to choose from. We've got an egg parasitoid above there, that's Opius agrilli. We have 2 larval parasitoids, Tetrasticus planipennis and Spathia scaleni, that we're specifically interested in here in Oregon. And these interrupt, again, egg or larval stage of development. There you can see that life cycle of EAB and the wasp kind of making its way into those different life stages to parasitize those life stages. And again, Tetrasticus is highly gregarious, so you get a number of its larvae developing in just one EAB. And it's especially proficient in smaller diameter trees that have thinner bark. It's got a shorter ovipositor, and so you'd want to select trees that are, smaller and have thinner bark. Whereas Spathia scaleni, also a gregarious larval parasitoid, would go after larger trees with more, larger puzzle piece, thick bark. And so it would have a longer ovipositor to get through into that larva. And then Opius agrilli, again, going after the egg stage, which this is an extremely small egg and a very small wasp. And that has its own caveats there too. Just for more imagery here, you've got the oviposition, part of the equation here where the female wasp finds the larvae within the wood, stings that larva or oviposits within it. And then you get the actual development of its own larva within the EAB larva. And all that's left, and a lot of times after these multiple parasitoid larvae develop, are the mandibles are a few scraps. They do a good job of taking these things out. And here's a closer look at those wasps as they develop. We got a lot of training from the USDA APHIS group. Russ Bullock, Jake Bodart, and some of our other representatives came out and did 2 different week-long trainings with us on how to select sites, how to go after effective release methods, and were just really helpful in training us on a lot of the things that we need to know to make this possible. And we, with their help, selected 2 sites just south of Forest Grove. This is Fernhill Wetlands, and just to the west, about a mile away, Gales Forest Grove, another wetlands, full of Oregon ash. We went ahead and classified individual ash trees as far as their DBH and their canopy classification, as far as the health of their canopy. And all of this information is important as you assess a release site. You want to know what kind of trees are there, and do you have a viable opportunity for those wasps that you're going to be actually releasing. And so Max Ragazzino and his team have been doing excellent work on those sites. And we kind of went overboard here. I think we did 4,000 plus individual tree assessments. We have learned now going forward, we'll probably do larger, more random selections of some of these areas instead of doing individual trees. But again, the release process is really interesting. And if you haven't connected with my group, Ragazzino, or Vincent Shoemaker, who does a lot of the releases in the East and measures the effectiveness of those efforts, Vincent and Max are great resources, and I'd love to connect you with them. And with that, I will say thank you to our cooperators and partners, those who have helped fund us, both federally here in the state. Just a huge amount of effort has gone into this, many different cooperative agreements and grants. And again, big shout out to our local cooperators who are making this possible on the ground to actually make SLAM happen and our surveys happen. And I'm open to any questions if they're there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Holthouse. That was really informative and impressive, actually, just how much you've been able to achieve in the past less than a year. So I do see a question in the chat from Gary Fish. He wants to know, how much was the emergency funding from the state?
That's the right question to be asking. I like that, Gary. Yeah, so we got initially the first 6-month segment was $550,000, and we put 60 towards treatment efforts, 120 towards helping the city of Forest Grove with felling trees and responding. We're also investing in a burn boss that will help us burn infested wood more efficiently and also create biochar. Really cool tool. I'd love to talk more about that if anyone has questions. And then a lot of the other remaining funds went towards personnel. If you do have this situation happen to you, you've got to build up a team immediately. Matt Mills, my coordinator, has been just a huge help in getting all this off the ground, and his 4 seasonals as well, as in the way of data collection. So yeah, that's a little bit on that. I can go into more detail, but yeah, good question.
Okay, and then I actually have a question. You mentioned that there were 40 agencies that you're working with. Were any of those like from outside of Oregon? I know it's kind of close to the Washington border, and I'm just curious if any states like California, any neighboring states, have any agencies that have like jumped on this or tried to like look for any EAB that they otherwise wouldn't have because of this detection.
Yeah, great question too. We do have a good mix of local, state, and federal cooperators in here. U.S. Forest Service, we've had Karen Ripley, who's Region 6, help us a whole lot. We've had, the BLM, several pretty large partners join us. And Yeah, I know that CDFA joined us pretty early on with some of the biological control release trainings that we did. They came up for those week-long trainings and participated. I don't want to throw Washington under the bus, but I think they've got other fish to fry right now, and they're not sure they have the resources to really do much at this time. They, of course, are keeping tabs on our efforts, but in some ways, I think they maybe have a different perspective on the situation, is what I'll say. But I know California's had involvement. Utah's reached out, has been really curious as to what we're doing and how we can interact with them better. And so yeah, I think a lot of my connection has been with California and Utah at this point.
Okay, interesting. And then, so do you think that the management program that you guys had from 2 years ago, do you think that that is like directly applicable to other states, that they could kind of just use that as a template, in other words, for their own response plans?
Yeah, I think so. I'm sure there's some fluff in there. As we all know, some of these response plans are, more tedious than they're worth sometimes. But I do know that, yeah, definitely large components of how to form the committee, how to connect with local cooperators, who the target audience should be when you're, doing outreach. A lot of that I got from that response plan. So I think if someone is interested, I'd be willing to share. Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay. Any other questions for Dr. Holthouse? Okay, well, then we will jump to Frank Etzler. He's in Montana, and I think that he was just gonna provide, some updates on the efforts going on in Montana for preparation for potential detection there. So you wanna unmute yourself, Frank?
Hi, everybody. Hope you're doing great this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. So for Montana, luckily, we do not have emerald ash borer as far as we know, but there is some worry for us about risk and what can be affected. So the major risk factor for Montana is that it is a recreational state. We have access to Glacier National Park and Yellowstone National Park. So we have people coming from all over the state, or all over the United States, to Montana to recreate in the wilderness. So that is a risk of human transported emerald ash borer. With the delisting federally of emerald ash borer, we put in a state quarantine right away. So we cannot import any ash products, except, again, like baseball bats, that's fine. But if you want to import nursery stock, that's not allowed. Wood, not allowed as well for ash. We want to protect it from being imported by human means. Other things that we need to, like with Cody's discovery of emerald ash borer in Oregon last year, we now have kind of threats coming from the east, south, and west. So we have emerald ash borer known from southeast South Dakota. We have it around Denver to the south of us, and now we have it in Oregon. So we've kind of really reamped our concern about emerald ash borer this past year. So I am the state survey coordinator and national resource section manager for the Montana Department of Agriculture. So I'm starting to begin planning for surveys next year, and I really want to start monitoring for emerald ash borer again. We've kind of slowed down on our monitoring program in the past years because it's been slow and hard to monitor such a large state. But now I think I want to re-ramp that up with the discovery in Oregon. Luckily, we still have a cooperative in our state. So we work very closely with the Montana Department of Natural Resources and also Montana State University Extension Services. And we have a really great dialogue already. So we already have a cooperative plan for spongy moth. So that is we have monitored for it since the 80s, and we really want to protect our forests. So we already have a plan there for action with detections of spongy moth in Montana. And I think we can really reapply that to emerald ash borer if that's ever discovered. And part of our worry in Montana with emerald ash borer is a lot of our urban forests have about 90% of the urban forest is green ash. We've been talking with city foresters ever since it's been discovered. to start beginning to diversify their forests. So they've been working over the past decade or so to diversify the forest. So whenever they cut down a green ash, they start replacing it with other tree species so we can get a more diverse urban forest. We also have a lot of native green ash in our riparian areas in eastern Montana. Eastern Montana is the high plains, Great Plains, not a lot of trees out there. So having the green ash in the riparian areas really keeps them healthy. And we're really worried about that from our east. So part of our idea is to kind of continue outreach. So we, working with the Montana Department of Natural Resources, we talk to nurseries, we talk to landscapers, and we talk to arborists, and we try to get them that outreach information because we feel those are going to be the first people who might detect it. So we want to know how to sample for it, how to look for it, what signs to look for. So if they ever find it, they know who to contact as well. We also have a Montana Invasive Species Council. Again, that works through water conservation districts. A lot of our worry recently has been importation of aquatic invasive species. So I think we can kind of transport all of that if we ever do find emerald ash borer into dealing with that problem if it ever arrives, or unfortunately when it arrives in our state. So that's pretty much what we're dealing with in Montana. We are trying to prevent it. I think that's the best possibility right now, but it feels almost like it's a losing battle at this time for our state, but we want to keep it out as long as possible. Any questions?
Any questions for Frank? Again, use the question and answer feature, or just use that little raise your hand doodad and we can unmute you. I have a quick question. You said you think it's pretty much inevitable that it will show up in Montana. Do you suspect that'll be like through nursery stock, or do you think it'll be like the firewood pathway? Just out of curiosity.
I would say firewood pathway.
Yeah.
I think that is the biggest. There's every year the number of tourists that come to the state increases, and a lot of them bring firewood with them. And hopefully at this stage, they understand not to move firewood. We try to have Don't Move Firewood campaigns. So a lot of the tourist information that's sent out by the state, we have Don't Move Firewood in it. So hopefully when they come, they don't move it. But you can only hold out for so long. So another worry that I have is natural spread over a longer period of time from South Dakota or up from Colorado. That would be another pathway, but hopefully with the development of biological controls, that spread is slowed down and controlled. But that would be a slower pathway, probably in the next couple decades. But I think that is also a realistic risk as well.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, Gary Fish just has a comment here. He said, I would hope no one is planting ash in Montana anymore. Oh. Yeah,
it's very rare to find it in nurseries now. A lot of them don't sell it. So they're not really planting it now. They push more for other species, but it was pushed many years ago really hard by the nurseries. So we still have a huge, dense urban forests with a lot of green ash.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions or comments for Frank or Cody? Okay, then going off of the whole firewood pathway bit, I'm just going to give a brief spiel here on part of the Don't Move Firewood campaign, since outreach is something that, I mean, that's our whole shtick. So hopefully I'll have enough time to give a little bit of sense of some of the services and resources we have. Let me share my screen here. And thank you both so much for sharing with us those details, and Cody for your presentation. Like I said, that was just really informative and awesome. So let me go to the slide, since we already got a good background on the EAB situation. And I have just a few minutes here. So I'll start here. We did a very large and inclusive firewood comparison report, excuse me, across the whole United States, where we looked at all sorts of quarantines, whether they be pest-based or firewood-based. And Lee, if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat the link to that report, in case you haven't seen it yet. We try to keep that updated, so I'm always bugging, state plant regulatory officials and stuff every year, just to try to make sure that we're on top of that. But I did pull out the EAB specific information. So as we can see, anything that's not gray here has some sort of regulation that affects pest movement, that affects firewood, whether or not it be the firewood itself, actually. But when it comes to EAB specifically, it's a lot less inclusive of the states. So with the federal deregulation of the domestic quarantine in 2021, that left a lot of states and various landowning entities up to their own whether or not they decided to regulate. And some states have decided, like Montana, put in the emergency quarantine for EAB. I believe California did as well. Since the detection in Oregon now has an interior quarantine, which is helpful. And so this shows interior quarantines, which is a lot less, even though we know a lot of these states does have EAB within. A lot of those quarantines, once existed, and then with the federal regulation, they became redundant. And so a lot of states dropped them. And then with the deregulation, again, leaving no quarantines there. So there is a lot of vulnerability as far as regulations go. It's my understanding that regulations are a hard thing to put through. And so, it's great for the states that have been able to do so since the federal deregulation. But sometimes, even states that do have a regulation, they're not communicated in a way that people know about them. And so with the firewood pathway, a lot of firewood users out there, they have no idea, that quarantine even exists, let alone that the firewood pathway is a thing in and of itself. And so, yeah, this is just another picture showing, where EAB has been detected and then any regulations. And so that's where we can come in. Certification was affected as well. But just with my limited time here, I just want to talk about outreach. So really, it's best to reach people before they leave their homes. And so, flyers and billboards are great, but they don't necessarily reach people before they've left their houses with firewood already in tow in their RV or their truck or whatever. So we took a big chunk of time and looked at state agency firewood communications, cooperative extension, state parks, as well as reservation systems. And we looked to see if there was any sort of firewood communications, whether or not there was a regulation, because you can always have best practice messaging. And the best sort of messages were things that really jumped out, were eye-catching, positive, simple, direct, action-oriented. Some states have entire pages dedicated to firewood, which is amazing, as long as, links for those sites can be found in relevant places. So your state parks general pages, especially your camping pages, and then of course any place where people are going to reserve sites, because a really important thing for people to keep in mind is that your average firewood user camper is not going online to look for firewood related information. They're looking for, how to reserve a site or directions or things like that. And then, secondhand, maybe looking for, is there going to be firewood available there? But they still won't necessarily know that, some places have rules against bringing firewood and the risks associated with doing so, whether or not there is a rule. And so again, just things that are empowering. This is how you can protect. This is the part you can play. Here's what you do. Here's what you can don't do. Bullets, just things that are really simple, straightforward, easy to read. Don't necessarily involve clicking on multiple links and going to other pages, because in this age, attention spans can be limited. I know mine is on the internet. And so things that jump out at me are what I'm going to pay attention to. And that is the case with firewood users as well. And so, you know, there's a lot of room for improvement across these metrics, especially the ones that we think firewood users are most likely to be using, like, again, those state parks and state park reservation systems. State agencies tend to do pretty good, especially departments of agriculture, because they often are the governing agency behind regulations. So that makes sense. But not necessarily where, you know, your average firewood users are going to go. So that's where we come in. We've been reaching out to states who are finding, you know, have room for improvement on their outreach and trying to get a hold of folks and, you know, point them to our resources. I am happy to always write up messaging, whether or not it's specific to a regulation a state might have, or even, again, just best practice action-oriented messaging. But we do provide a free service of customizing graphics. And so we can work with states and write exactly what you want us to write, your logos, anything like that. And then the only cost associated would be any printing costs if you wanted to actually have a physical copy of something. And then you can reach out to me, Laurel.Downs@tnc.org, or my supervisor, Lee Greenwood, lgreenwood@tnc.org, and we will be happy to help in any way we can boost people's research or outreach. I don't know how much we can do in research. Might be a little limited there, but is there any questions for me with 1 minute left? Thank you, Lee. Lee did put in the chat the link to the report. It's pretty technical, but it's very inclusive of pretty much everybody's regulations. So with that, any questions for us or Cody or Frank?
Thanks for that, Laurel. I'm learning a lot every time I see your presentations, and I was screenshotting some of them. It's nice to see that kind of national view of where we're at on regulations here. That's wonderful. And I apologize too. I think I was looking back trying to see how long I was supposed to talk. I hope I didn't crunch you into nothing. I'm so sorry.
No, I was thrilled with that. I give this talk a lot, so it was really nice to be able to like sit back and see in detail everything you guys are doing, and I learned a lot. So I really appreciate that.
Well, very gracious of you. Thanks again.
Okay, well, we will have the recording of this on our website and on YouTube for anybody to see. And again, any questions for me or for other speakers, you can just reach out to me. And is it okay if I give your email, Frank and Cody, out to anybody who might have follow-up questions?
Yes.
Yeah, fine with me.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So it is 2 o'clock, and so I will again say thank you to everybody who participated, and everybody have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.